Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Katherin Rogers about the Boethian response to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge, according to which God's timelessness helps solve the problem.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Katherin Rogers, who's professor of philosophy at the University of Delaware. Kate specializes in philosophy of religion and medieval philosophy. She's written extensively on St. Anselm of Canterbury in particular. Her books include Anselm on Freedom, published in 2008 by Oxford University Press, Freedom and Self-Creation, Anselmian Libertarianism, published in 2015 by Oxford University Press, and recently an excellent book on free will and science called The Experimental Approach to Free Will, Freedom in the Laboratory, published this year, that is 2022, by Routledge. So thanks so much for joining us, Kate. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Well, thanks very much for inviting me to be on your show. The recent work, the most recent book, is really kind of out of my area. Mostly what I do is medieval and philosophy of religion, but it just seemed to me that there were respectable people, thinking that science could show we don't have robust free will. And so I thought it was worthwhile to go ahead and write a book about how not only has science not shown it, but science really can't show that. But now I'm happy to say I'm back at work in the medieval area. You ask how I got interested in the issue, and I thought about the question and realized that I don't know. I must have been interested in it very young, because I vividly remember in 7th grade at lunch arguing with a friend of mine, and my position was that even if someone is threatening to kill you if you don't, do X, you still have a certain amount of freedom, because you could choose to be killed, right? And I have to say, I think maybe nowadays I would be a little more nuanced about the argument there. But what happened a little after 7th grade was freshman year of college, I read St. Anselm of Canterbury. And you're probably familiar with St. Anselm of Canterbury from the famous and infamous ontological argument. But there's all kinds of really interesting things to say about free will, including that you're free even if someone is threatening to kill you. And so, here I am, little freshman in college, and I read St. Anselm, and I think, man, this guy's probably right about most things. And so I changed my major from drama to philosophy, and have been sort of reading and rereading Anselm ever since. And my opinion has not changed that much. I think he's probably right about most things, including and especially what he has to say about free will. So a large part of my career has been kind of showing how you can use sort of St. Anselm's approach to solve a lot of free will problems. So that's what I've been up to.
Nice.
Yeah, very cool.
Thanks.
In our previous episode, we talked with Simon Kittle about an argument for the conclusion that divine foreknowledge and free will are incompatible. And the response to this argument that we're going to be talking about today is called Boethianism, after the 6th century philosopher Boethius. The view is called by different names, including Thomism, the eternity solution, and the timelessness solution. And crucial to the view is the claim that God is, in some sense, outside of time. Could you say a bit about what it means for God to be outside of time and how this is supposed to help with the problem of freedom and foreknowledge?
I guess I could. First of all, I think it's best to start with the nature of time itself. My understanding is, at least in the debate in which I'm involved, which is sort of situating the questions about time in divine eternity and divine foreknowledge, that there's basically two theories of time. One is presentism, and that would be the thought that absolutely all that exists is the present moment. And the past is just non existent, the future is just non existent. Anything that exists at this present moment, including God. And so in the philosophy of religion, there are some philosophers who go that route. The other view, which is the one that I defend and that I ascribe to St. Anselm, scholars disagree, but I really think I have the texts to, make the case. Is sometimes it's called eternalism, sometimes it's called four-dimensionalism. I prefer the term isotemporalism because that emphasizes the thought that all times are equal. That's sort of the bottom line here. What that means is all the times of the universe exist equally, and past, present, and future are subjective to a given perceiver at a given time. So what you and I perceive as the present or the past or the future, that's relative to us here and now. And of course, I think we're all familiar with that view, right? Because that's the view that time travel stories assume, right? You can get in the time machine and you can go to the past because the past is there. And when you get there, it's your present, right? Or you can go to the future because the future is there. And when you get there, that's your present. And, where you came from becomes your past because you've traveled into the future. So it's not a view that's, totally alien to people. And my understanding is that it's the position that contemporary physics adopts. Now, I know very, very little about contemporary physics. My understanding is that contemporary physics almost assumes that all times are equally real. They're all there in this spatio-temporal universe. And I think Anselm says that, interestingly enough. And so if we say that God is outside of time, what we mean is all of that whole spatio-temporal reality is immediately present to God. God has access to all of it. It's all there, and God is not sort of embedded in time. He doesn't experience things sequentially the way you and I would. So he's outside, just in the sense that he's not sort of subject to it. So then the question is, well, what does that have to do with free will? Here's how it works. And again, honestly, Anselm says all this. It's just brilliant. He's back at the beginning of the 12th century, and he's saying this. So here's the thought. You make a choice for X over Y at time T, and by hypothesis, your choice fits the criteria for a really robust libertarian choice. And by that, what I'm going to mean is several things. In terms of your own sort of innate powers or abilities, you absolutely could have chosen Y. You absolutely have this option to choose X or Y in terms of your own abilities. In terms of causes, there's just absolutely no kind of necessitating cause that resulted in you choosing X. And this is the thing that Anselm especially emphasizes, your choice for X really comes from you. It is say, from yourself. So the buck really stops with you. Okay, so that's a free choice. You make it at time T. If you choose X at time T, then it is true that you could not fail to choose X at time t, right? I mean, by the laws of logic. It's just logically necessary that if you choose X at time t, you choose X at time t.
Mm-hmm.
In isotemporalism, in an isotemporalist universe, it's always true that you choose X at time t.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, God, having access to the whole universe, knows that you choose X at time t. But then the question is, well, how is it that God knows it? Because he sees you choosing it. His knowledge comes from your choosing it. If it's a libertarian free choice, that's the only thing that could ground the truth of your choice, and hence God's knowledge of your choice, is your actual choice at time t. So, the question would be, how could divine foreknowledge interfere if it's your choice that's causing the knowledge?
Mm-hmm.
Just like, suppose for hypothesis' sake, I know you're on this call now. Right? If you're on this call now, you can't possibly fail to be on this call now. And I know you're on this call now.
Right.
Does that mean that you're not free because you can't fail to be on this call now? No, right? Now I know because you're present to me, but of course it's all present to God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything is immediately present to God. So that's okay, isn't it? Does that work?
I think so. I mean, the way we've talked about the challenge to free will from divine foreknowledge has always been about God being back there in the past and kind of foreseeing what you'll do. And since God's knowledge, he has it infallibly. Like, you can't make God wrong about that stuff that he believes back there in the past. And, you can't change the past anyway. So it always focused on we might call it the accidental necessity of the past, or the fact that this is over and done with. But everything you've said about God's knowledge and how he has it in virtue of seeing what we're doing, it doesn't have God in the past because he's not kind of in time at all.
Yeah, I mean, God, your knowledge of the past doesn't somehow make your past choices or somebody else's past choices unfree,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, the point is that it's all there the way, we think of the past, except that on isotemporalism, it's not that the future is non-existent and the past is this, fixed thing.
Yeah.
It's that it's all there. And, you could say it's fixed, except that, the claim is that if it's free choice, we're freely bringing about what happens, just the way you might have freely brought about what happened yesterday, and you're freely bringing about what happens today. Well, you're freely bringing about what happens, in 10 years by what you do in 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of seems like on Anselm's view, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, and on Boethius's view too, it's not really so much that we should think that God's outside of time because it helps to solve this puzzle about freedom and foreknowledge. It's more like we have these other reasons for thinking that God's outside of time, or we should, be eternalist rather than presentist or something like that. And then we just get this application to the freedom and foreknowledge puzzle. Is that the way you think of it, or is that the way Anselm?
That's true with Anselm. I mean, I'm a little uncomfortable with the Boethian title. I see where it comes from, because Boethius does talk about God knowing things in eternity, but Boethius is pretty clearly a compatibilist. I mean, he very clearly, having talked about God knowing things in eternity, he then goes on to say, God knows what you're going to choose because God knows what he himself is going to make you choose. Mm-hmm. And Anselm is like, no, we can't have that. You might sin, and we know good and well God is not making you sin. But I think you're absolutely right about. Boethius himself in the Consolation for Philosophy does kind of bring in God knowing things in eternity in the free will discussion. Yeah. That's not the way Anselm does it. Anselm, the free will foreknowledge solution comes actually kind of late in Anselm's work, and earlier on, what he's more concerned with, for example, in the proslogion, which is where the ontological argument comes from, is it's to sort of unpack the thought of, at the beginning of the proslogion and the ontological argument, it's God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived. And so people very often read that chapter and not the rest of the book. But the rest of the book is, let me tell you what a being like that would be like, and among other things, a being like that couldn't possibly be a presentist God, right? Because then God would just exist at this little tiny thin time slice of the present. And then you have this terrible puzzle. I mean, contemporary presentists have this terrible puzzle, and it goes back at least to St. Augustine. How can the present is changing, right? It used to be 5 minutes ago, and now it isn't. Now it's now. How can an absolutely immutable God, which is the sort of God of classical theism, how can that God interact with a changing universe? I mean, presentists just have this awful problem. Whereas if you if you take it that divine eternity kind of means, and I think there are good texts in the proslogion where Anselm seems to say this too, means that all of time is there for God, really there for God. Then you have a being in which none greater can be conceived, because God's knowledge is immediate, right? God knows everything immediately. It's not that he's remembering the past and, maybe he has some good ideas about the future or something like that. No. It's all immediately there. He's immediately seeing it. But omnipotence, right? God acts on all of the times. And to constrain God to this tiny present, just would be a very diminutive kind of a God. So, Anselm says that divine eternity, means that God has sort of access to all of time, and that's much greater than a being who wouldn't have that. Right. And then sort of toss in, contemporary physics. If time really is a function of our sort of physical universe, then God is the author of the universe, so he's got to be. If he's that in which nothing greater can be conceived, he's got to be outside of the constraining categories of this creation that he's made, and he's got to see time as it really is, right? The presentist. I was just at a thing at Rutgers, and it was really interesting because it was about God and space-time, and presentists have a real problem with physics because. If God is seeing reality as reality is, and contemporary physics is right in the assumption that, or not the assumption, but their theoretically well-grounded view that all of time somehow is real or there or something like that, then it seems like you would just have to say that God is outside of time in the sense of having sort of immediate access to all of it. So I should add that if the physicists in 100 years completely change their minds and all become presentists, I would still, in 100 years, right, be a little elderly by that point, perhaps. I would still say that God is outside of time and it's all present to God, and and then you'd have to say something like, well, physics deals with the world as we experience it. But it's kind of charming that at least the contemporary physics seems to support the thought that all of time is there, because that really, I think, grounds a really plausible and theoretically useful view of divine eternity.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great.
So besides the application here for free will and divine foreknowledge, this dilemma that's sometimes brought up, what are some of the other implications of this view about God's relationship to time for like your philosophical or theological commitments?
See that? On the one hand, I want to say, oh, really, hardly any, because I mean that's not the whole answer. Okay, that's the first part. But I mean, there's a sense in which it doesn't. It's kind of like if you're an idealist, which I happen to be, but that's a totally other issue. Um, it doesn't change it doesn't make any difference at all. Well, at first glance, it doesn't make any difference at all to the way things seem to us, right? Um, Now there is at least this implication, which I'm okay with, and that is that that the human person is, I mean, well, everything is like this, but we care most about us, quite reasonably. Um, the human person exists across time, so some people will describe it as that we're time worms, and I don't like the idea of being a worm, so I'd rather say ribbon. We're time ribbons, and satiny, shiny.
Yes.
We're time ribbons existing across time,
Mhm.
and that seems okay. In a Christian context, occasionally people will say that they don't like that because in a Christian context, the thought of repentance and forgiveness and salvation is obviously very crucial.
Mhm.
And here's if you're this time ribbon from conception stretching on infinitely into the future, um, then that sinful part is is still with you. It's always with you. It's always there in
Yeah.
this isotemporal universe. To which I respond that a couple of things. I mean, one thing is maybe it's just as well to always know that one is presumably, if one has repented and been forgiven, a saved sinner,
Mhm.
Yeah.
as opposed to just that part of me is just non-existent. It's gone now. So I'm not. I mean, I think that part's okay. And then assuming, as one tends to, that one is bound for glory, if one is trying to stay on the straight and narrow, that infinitude of the future would kind of overwhelm that past
Yeah.
uh, sinfulness. So I think the qualms that people have. Well, here, so maybe the qualm is kind of a. I hadn't thought of this before, but maybe the qualm is kind of part of a bigger issue, which is that so some people think if you adopt this sort of isotemporal view that you're saying things don't change, and that's not true, right? You're just saying things are different at different times. But it's true that the whole doesn't cease to be what it is. Things are what they are, and that's kind of the end of that story. So but back to the narrow ribbon of the of the repentant Christian. Um, I think it's okay to say that along this ribbon there are these kind of different uh, events, and they're all there in yourself. um, I don't think in the final analysis you lose anything, and maybe you gain something in the sense that the whole self is just always real. So,
Yeah.
but otherwise, I'm not really sure what. I mean, I don't, except for free will. I don't do a whole lot of metaphysics.
Mhm.
So, I think there are all kinds of maybe consequences for metaphysical views that most people don't care a whole lot about. Unlike, which is really unfair, right? Because all of those goofy metaphysical views, turn out to have deep practical consequences. But I
Right.
mean, free will, right, is right there at the top. Anybody can see how important free will is. And if you can, um, if even though it's icing on the cake, if you can reconcile divine foreknowledge with free will, I think you've got that's a really good reason to adopt this view of time and the question of the relationship of God's eternity to time.
Yeah. That's great. Well, if we could turn to maybe a couple of objections to the Boethian, Anselmian view. One thing that we talked about in our interview with Linda Zagzebski back several seasons ago in the podcast is that it seems to some like the Boethian solution, although it solves the problem of free will and divine foreknowledge, there's like a potential parallel problem of free will and divine timeless knowledge. Maybe another way of putting this objection is something like this: divine timeless knowledge about human actions threatens our free will just as much as divine foreknowledge would. Maybe because, the divine eternal realm is fixed in just the way that some people think that the past is fixed. So what do you make of this objection to the timelessness response to freedom and foreknowledge?
Yeah, I have trouble understanding it. So everybody agrees the past is fixed. So let's say yesterday, you chose X over Y, and now today, and suppose you chose it freely with, you met all the criteria that I laid out for a libertarian free choice, and now today, you look back and you go, well, the past is fixed, so I guess I couldn't have chosen Y. I chose X, so I guess my choice for X was just necessary, and I wasn't free. I mean, to me that seems clearly false.
Right.
And then if you're choosing X right now in the present, you can't possibly be failing to choose X by logical necessity. And so it would be really funny to say, gee, I guess I'm not free because as I'm choosing X, I can't be choosing Y, right? Even though I met all the criteria for a libertarian free choice, if I choose X by logical necessity. It'd be funny to say you're not free. So then I guess somehow the problem is the future, but on isotemporalism, right? It's all present. So if the past and the present, if the fact that you're choosing X in the past and the present means that there is this kind of what I would take to be completely innocuous logical necessity that you choose X. If the future is just subjective to us, but in fact, it's all there. There really is no. I mean, the future is fixed, yes, in the sense that there are true. It's there, and there are truths about it. It's no less fixed than the past and the present, but how that translates into, and therefore you're not free. That's the part that I don't get. And I'm pausing in case you want.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the argument would, if fleshed out, would have some kind of transfer of necessity principle, like with the consequence argument,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the necessity of, if I choose X, then I choose X. If that undermines freedom, then it's just not possible for anyone to be free, right?
Yeah.
Right. So. Right. I mean, so let me try to. I was just thinking about this. I mean, it seems like if the claim is that my choosing X at time t, and by hypothesis time t is future from our present perspective. If my choosing X at time t, I mean, it does make it true for all eternity, from forever to forever. It makes it true that I choose X at time t. But if that undermines my freedom, then it would seem like I can't ever be free, because after I choose X, I'm not free because I chose it. And as I choose X, I'm not free because I'm choosing it. And before I choose X, I can't choose Y before I choose X, because that's not when I make the choice, right? That's before I make the choice. So I can't choose Y afterwards, I can't choose Y during, and I can't choose Y before. So if the fact of my choosing X at time t is what undermines my freedom, then there is no time at which I could be free. So we can't say that, right? What we have to say is that the kind of logical necessity of, if I choose X at time t, then I choose X at time t, that just doesn't undermine freedom. And when I spelled out what I take to be the criteria for a libertarian free choice, I have to allow that there is a kind of necessity. But before I choose X, there's a kind of necessity in my choosing X on this isotemporal view, because, and if God knows, obviously, but God, anyway, there's a kind of necessity, but it's a necessity that I authored, right? I'm the one. My choice is what generates that necessity. And so again, it's yes, there's a certain kind of logical necessity that if I choose X, I choose X. Mm-hmm. But how that could conflict with my freedom, I just don't see it.
Yeah. That sounds similar to Peter Van Nimwagen's response to logical fatalism. I think it's in chapter 2 of an essay on free will, or maybe it's like reprinted there. But he talks about how propositions about what we'll do are timelessly true. They're not, true in advance or anything like that in a way that might call into question our freedom. But if they're timelessly true, then yeah, they're going to have this kind of maybe this logical necessitation relationship. But insofar as they're true because of what we do, perhaps it seems like that doesn't really call into question our freedom. And it sounds like you want to say this sort of same thing about God's timeless knowledge.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. As long as you are saying that the knowledge comes, it's your choice that on which that knowledge depends, then I just don't see how it can conflict with freedom. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wonder if you think there's something crucial here about the propositions or God's knowledge being outside of time. I wonder if you think, like, I know this isn't your view and it's not Anselm's view, but if God were in time, imperfect though that may make him, right? If God were in time and knew in advance what we're going to do, but the reason he had his foreknowledge was because he sort of looked into his time telescope and saw what we were doing in the future. And so the only reason he has that past knowledge is in virtue of our doing what we actually do. Do you think that similarly that wouldn't call into question our freedom, or do you think there's a difference here?
Maybe I'm misunderstanding. It seems to me like that's an incoherent picture. If you grant that the truth of what you choose, I call this the grounding principle, that what grounds the truth of what you choose is your actual choice, then God with his telescope would have to be his temporoscope, would have to be seeing a future that's real. Mm-hmm. But, for where I come from, God is the absolute source of everything, not himself. And so if something is real, God is immediately causing it, and therefore the thought that somehow there could be this future, um, you know, distant from God that he can perceive. I mean, maybe I should have started there with classical theism, right? That God is immediately present to everything that exists, and he's keeping everything in existence from moment to moment. And he doesn't know propositionally; he knows things immediately.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some sense in which he knows that human beings use propositions or something like that. But what God knows is all the stuff that's there. So the picture of God kind of over here perceiving the stuff over there is not really a picture that I can assimilate.
Sure.
And it would be a problem, right? Because I guess. Well, so maybe if you did it in terms of God telling some prophet, God tells a prophet, God sees you choosing X at time T, and he tells, Jeremiah that Taylor is going to choose X at time T. And so Jeremiah's in time, and Jeremiah knows you're going to choose X at time T.
Yeah.
But the fact that Jeremiah is in time doesn't, it doesn't change anything as long as it's your choice that's kind of grounding the truth of Taylor chooses X at time T, and that's how Jeremiah, via God, of course, knows that you're choosing X at time T.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so what do you think the biggest objection is to this view of God being outside time?
Well, there is a big one, I think. I mean, if you read it the way I do, where it entails isotemporalism, and whatever the physicists say, isotemporalism in terms of the phenomenology, in terms of the way we experience things, I think is really, really weird.
Yeah.
Because, in time travel stories, it's like it's fine, because you go back in time and there's, stuff, and maybe you see yourself doing X. You go in the future, and then, but the thing that seems the weirdest to me is like the you of 5 minutes ago is just as real. Whatever you were doing 5 minutes ago, that's going on, just the way what we think of as now is going on. I think in terms of our experience, it's really, really weird. But there are a couple of things to say, okay? Even though it's really weird. One thing is that I don't think there's any really non-weird view of time.
Yeah, that's right.
Like if you take presentism, the way Augustine explains presentism is that it's the non-extended point at which the non-existent future becomes the non-existent past. It's just like, how much nothing can you get? It doesn't feel at all.
Yeah.
So so on the one hand, it's like isotemporalism is like really weird experientially, but that's so is time. And then the other thing to say is, well, it's one of those existential choices, right? There's you put up with the weirdness, or you lose a really helpful, robust theory of divine eternity that allows you to reconcile freedom and foreknowledge. Well, I'll just put up with the weirdness and save the the freedom and foreknowledge and good view of divine eternity.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Kate. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, I have to say that I have kind of, in many ways, nothing personal, tended to avoid social media. So probably the best thing would just be to go to my department webpage, which I think is being revamped even as we speak, at the University of Delaware, Philosophy Department, University of Delaware, and that would list the works. But yeah, otherwise, I'm not really on much of anything.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's fine. Yeah.
Trying to
We'll
keep
link to that, and we'll link to your books too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. This was great.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was so much fun.
Yeah. In our next episode, we will discuss the Occamist response to the problem of divine foreknowledge, and our guest will be Amy Seymour, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Fordham University.